So he had a sense of humor. He occasionally joshed even the brethren in serious circumstance. There was, for example, today that a newspaper article came out announcing that a man had sold his wife, and the price was a bull-eye watch. A recent convert came up the street from the Maid of Iowa. The prophet greeted him on a horse and said, "You're not the man that sold your wife for a bull-eye watch, are you?" He didn't know quite how to take that, but explained he was not. On another occasion, serious intent, but humorous overtones, the prophet dressed up in the worst clothes he could find, got on a horse, and rode down to the Maid of Iowa just as it was emitting a whole load of converts from England. The first man that came up the row, he stopped. "Why are you here?" he inquired. "I have joined the Mormon Church." "What do you know about Joseph Smith?" "I know he is a prophet of God." "What if I told you I am Joseph Smith?" "If you are Joseph Smith, then I know you are a prophet of God." The prophet smiled, struck hands, and said, "I am the prophet, but I've dressed up in these rough clothes just so you'll understand that if you expect somebody other than a human, you might as well get right back on that boat and go back to England." He spent his life, it seems to me, half the time trying to convince the slow and sludgy people who had little faith that God was indeed with him and with them, and the other half alerting them that a prophet is only a prophet when he is a prophet, which means when he is inspired of God. The rest of the time he's a mere mortal, has opinions, makes mistakes, and in the general way of speaking, has to put his pants on one leg at a time like everyone else. It was difficult to strike that balance. Some thought he was too human, some thought he was too prophetic. Both were wrong. We should mention one other story. George A. Smith was a cousin of the prophet Joseph Smith and was, in girth at least, a larger man. He weighed nearly 300 pounds. They were discussing William W. Phelps as an editor, and Phelps had a gift as well as a curse for using language in a most abrasive way. He managed in his editorials to offend almost everyone. George A. Smith responded that he thought Phelps had a certain literary zeal and that as far as he was concerned, he would make him editor of his paper if only he had the right to read it. And the prophet laughed at that and said, "George A., you have it just about right." And then he hugged him and said, "George A., I love your soul." And then this bit of serious counsel: never get discouraged. If I were in the deepest coal pit of Nova Scotia and had the Rocky Mountains piled on top of me, I would not be discouraged, and I would come out on top. George A. was moved almost to tears and said, "I hope my love will be shown to you by my actions, Joseph." There is next the question of whether in all of his attitudes the prophet demonstrated appropriate humility and the very thing he taught in word, namely compassion and forbearance and forgiveness. He himself once said, "I have a subtle devil to deal with, and I can only curb him by being humble." No braggadocio, no threats, no vainglorying. You do not have power over the adversary and his hosts except through the power of Christ. And you do not have such power save you are humble and receptive. What is humility? Well, there are 1,000 definitions, but it means, at least I take it, acknowledging one's dependence. Acknowledging when and where one is not self-sufficient. And Joseph, according to those who knew him best, was in that sense humble Now, we're not here talking about boldness. He had that. It's not the opposite of humility. We're not talking about willingness to endure in strength. He had that, and that is not the opposite of humility. We are saying that Joseph did not manifest the debilitating pride that destroys humility. That is the witness of several. May I quote to Eliza R. Snow, who had heard of the prophet and some very ugly things, happened to be at home on a given day when the prophet called, chatted with her family. She was in another room, but the door was half ajar, and through the crack in that door, as the prophet sat down by the fire and began to warm his hands, she had a direct, straight view of his face. Now, he was, of course, unaware of being watched. His face was in repose. In less than a minute, Eliza R. Snow became convinced that this was an honest man. And as she later joined the church and was often in his home, a kind of babysitter and help for a time in Kirtland, she records in poetry that she first admired him in his public ministry, saw him as a prophet, but that not until she saw him in his own home, on his own knees, in relationship to his children, did her whole heart go out to him in admiration. She was, he said, as humble as a little child. Was the prophet an emotional man? In all the worthy senses of that word, the answer is yes. Easily the tears sprang to his eyes. And in varied situations. There is, for example, the testimony of Parley P. Pratt that as he got off the boat, having been on a long mission, and the prophet came down to greet him, the prophet hugged him and just wept. And finally, when Parley could extricate himself, he said, "Joseph, if you feel that bad about it, I'll go back." He wept too at goodbyes. The tears were flowing fast the day he said goodbye to his family before he went to Richmond jail. And the Lord himself acknowledges all that when he says in a revelation, speaking of Joseph, "His tears I have seen, and his prayers I have heard. And I will cause that he shall mourn for Zion no more." He sometimes characterized himself as a rough stone that rolling down a mountain comes in contact with various things until it becomes smooth. He also occasionally called himself a lone tree. He had learned in Vermont that those maples that were alone had to develop early, deep roots, and if not, then came the blast that took them down. He felt, for all of his social sense, deeply lonely, and said, Wilford Woodruff records once, "Would to God that I could unbosom my feelings once to my friends, but I never expect to in this life. You do not know me," he said in the King Follett Discourse, "you do not know my heart." And then this remarkable phrase, "I do not blame any man for not believing my history. If I had not experienced what I have, I could not have believed it myself."